Hi guys, so hopefully you've managed to pick a few things out of this passage and we get a bit more information here. So obviously first of all we get the reference to Mrs. Cratchit, who's dressed out but poorly in a twice-turned gown but brave in ribbons that are cheap. So basically her clothes are old and dishevelled, but she's not complaining again, she's making the most of it. She's tried to take her dress, which she's had to turn and re-sew because it's a bit old and frayed, and add ribbons to it to try and make it look a little bit pretty. So she hasn't got money to go and buy new clothes, but she'll make the best of what she got. And obviously the same for her daughter. It tells us, doesn't it, that Belinda is also brave in ribbons. So likewise, Belinda's clothes, she doesn't have the latest thing, she doesn't have really nice luxurious clothes, but she is making the best of everything she's got, and obviously that's something we can really admire about her. We then meet Master Peter Cratchit, who is taking on more manly responsibilities, isn't he? He's plunged a fork into the saucepan of potatoes. But the references here that are interesting, obviously, to his shirt, his monstrous shirt collar. Monstrous, obviously trying to indicate that it's much too big. He's a boy in man's clothing, and that's because he's borrowed Bob's shirt. And again, even though he's got to look smart on Christmas Day, he's got to borrow a shirt of his dad because he doesn't have his own nice shirt to wear. But he is just delighted. He considers himself gallantly attired. He's really proud of how he looks. And he yearns to show himself in the fashionable parks. So we get another sense of children like Tim who are really idealised in their ability to make the best of what they've got. But I think as well as it's suggesting that Peter is, excited by wearing his father's shirt, it also gives us this sense, doesn't it, of childhood being stolen, which is a key idea of the text throughout, that children don't have chance to stay as children. He's trying to grow into the clothes of a man at an age where he shouldn't have to, okay? And then we get the two smaller Cratchits. I think the interesting thing with them is the verbs tearing, screaming, and then further down I think they're dancing. Verbs of joy. This is what childhood should be, not just on Christmas Day, but this is what childhood should be. Children being free to enjoy it, and not with the adult responsibilities of earning money for their family. So many children in Victorian times, their childhood was cut short, either because they died young or because they had to take on the roles of adults. They had to work from very young age. And here we go, they danced as well. So we've got an image of this family who are so joyous and uplifting, and it's no wonder they have such a strong effect on Scrooge. We then have Martha, and it says very clearly here, a girl. Now, Dickens could have chosen any noun here. He could have said a woman, a young woman, a lady. He chose girl because girl has connotations of youth. She is young. Here's Martha, mother, cried the two young Cratchits. Hurrah, there's such a goose, Martha. Why, bless your heart alive, how late you are, said Mrs. Cratchit, kissing her a dozen times and taking off her shawl and bonnet. We'd a deal of work to finish up last night, replied the girl, and had to clear away this morning, mother. And here is the sense, isn't it? We don't know how old she is, we never find this, but we assume she's young, she's not much more than a child, but she's working endless amounts of hours, and this is the reality for young girls at the time. She works as a milliner's assistant, so she works in a hat shop. She has no legal protection. She probably would have worked hours and hours and hours, a few hours off for Christmas, and that would be it, straight back to work. So her childhood is being obviously taken, and that's the case for so many. So again, we can see, as with our Tiny Tim extract, that it's not enough just to know what the themes are and be able to discuss them. You will get a passage and you have to be able to find important words and explain why those words are important in relation to themes. Now, of course, you don't do that as a series of notes and colour coding. You do that as a paragraph. So here's the fun bit I'm sure you've all been looking forward to. We'll do that together. So we'll use this passage, the notes that we made, and we'll write a little paragraph. So the question says, how does Dickens use Tiny Tim to present ideas about childhood when he is first introduced? And obviously first introduced equals this extract. So we're going to start with an overview. We're not going to try and analyse any of the particular words. We're going to give an overview of how Tiny Tim is presented in the whole extract. So we'll use the wording of the fact question. So we'll say, when he is first introduced, Dickens presents Tim in idealised terms. He appears to be an angel of a child who is selfless and deserves much more from society. Okay, so we're just kind of giving that general overview of how Tim is presented in the whole extract. But of course we need to be more specific. We're used to these words now, yeah, general, specific, thematic. We have to be thinking more specifically about Tim. To do that, we go back to our passage and we pick some words. So we can use our phrase we always use when we're going to be more specific, in particular. And we can then start to talk about some words. So in particular, Bob describes Tim using the simile as good as gold. And as you know, once we've given a textual detail, we always say something about the whole detail in terms of what we can infer. Now, when I read that, when Bob says that Tim is as good as gold, I infer from that he really is proud of his son, that Tim is a really well-behaved child, and that Bob is incredibly proud of his son. I'm not going to talk about the connotations of language here because that would be too much. What I can infer. So I'll say, which leads the reader to infer that Tim is a very well-behaved child and that Bob is incredibly proud of his son. But of course, inference isn't enough. We need analysis. So we can then shift into that close analysis of language. And we know what we want to say. We want to talk about the use of the word gold. It's precious and valuable, suggesting that Tim is precious and valuable, but also suggesting that childhood is, and we shouldn't ignore the suffering of children. So if we go back to our paragraph, I can say Dickens's reference to gold is particularly interesting because gold conveys connotations of preciousness. Ooh, let me just, I've got a few too many S's in there. It is a very valuable metal which presents the idea that Tim is a precious child. Despite the fact that he is poor and disabled, he has value. His life, actually, I'll change that to his life has value. Okay, so I've talked about the word and what the word reveals about Tim as a character. But obviously our question isn't Tim, is it? The question isn't how does Dickens present Tiny Tim? The question is how does he use Tim to present ideas about childhood? And so that's the next step. I need to link it to the bigger theme of childhood. So here we always use our tentative phrasing. So we've got our familiar format. It seems that Dickens is using this image to make a wider point about the preciousness of childhood and reminding his reader that all children are valuable, are important, regardless of the wealth of their family, and should be cared for. Okay, so now I've not, in that last sentence, not talked about Tim particularly. I've talked about the wider point, the message about childhood. And that's the key thing. I've started off with character, but I've shifted into theme, but constantly making sure that everything links together. So let's check what we've got. When is, oh, I missed the word Tim here, didn't I? So, when Tim is first introduced, Dickens presents him. Yeah, that makes better sense, doesn't it? When Tim is first introduced, Dickens presents him in idealised terms. He appears to be an angel of a child who is selfless and deserves much more from society. In particular, Bob describes Tim using the simile as good as gold, which leads the reader to infer that Tim is a very well-behaved child and that Bob is incredibly proud of his son. Dickens' reference to gold is particularly interesting because gold conveys connotations of preciousness. It's a very valuable metal which presents the idea that Tim is a precious child. Despite the fact that he is poor and disabled, his life has value. It seems that Dickens is using this image to make a wider point about the preciousness of childhood and reminding his reader that all children are important regardless of the wealth of their family and should be cared for. So there's potentially more I could go into, but I'm happy with that, yeah? That I've got the idea that I'm talking about character, and then in my last sentence I'm talking about the character's relation to themes. So if you feel able to, can you give this a go? Now you have a choice really, you could carry this on. So you could carry on this question. How does Dickens use Tiny Tim to present ideas about childhood when he's first introduced? So I've written a paragraph. You could write a second one, but by referring to this detail that we highlighted yellow earlier. So you could talk about the use of the language of the church and the reminder to the reader that Jesus didn't turn his back. However, you might prefer to write about the second extract, the one that you worked on independently and then we went through together. In which case, you can do this question. How does Dickens use the Cratchit children? You might want to try and do both. But have a go at writing a paragraph about the Cratchit children, but about how they're used to present ideas about childhood, not about them as characters. Just give it a go, guys. It's hard. You haven't got a teacher there to work with you and prompt you along the way. The work you guys are sending to me is awesomely fabulous. So keep on trying. Please keep sending us work. We can send advice and feedback. You can then improve it. And then once we get back to school, we can practice a bit more. But enjoy your bank holiday and I'll speak to you all again next week.